Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and provide a quick introduction to who we are for those of you who are new to our community. Since its founding, our goal at the Center for Global Affairs has been to prepare global citizens to make a positive impact in the world. We do this through a variety of activities, including our 2 graduate programs, one in global affairs and a recently launched MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a variety of professional and personal enrichment courses, continuing education courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising. This includes several professional certificates. And of course, we host free public events such as this that expand upon the critical issues and timely topics that we cover in our classrooms. We'll send out a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. We've also reserved some time at the end of today's presentation for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A tool. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Jumo Ayandele is a postdoctoral research fellow at NYU's Center for the Study of African and the African Diaspora, and a non-resident fellow and adjunct faculty member here at the Center for Global Affairs. In her most recent position as a senior researcher at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, Dr. Ayandele supported the production of real-time data on political violence in Nigeria. She is passionate about understanding the dynamic relationship and intersection between African governance, human development, and political stability, and has won numerous awards and grants to conduct her research, with visiting fellowships at the National Defense College in Abuja and the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po. A brilliant African studies scholar, Dr. Ayandele continues to collaborate with international and regional decision makers, as well as government institutions in promoting human security initiatives and programs that can create a peaceful and secure Africa. She holds a Ph.D. in global affairs from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and an M.P.A. in international development policy and management, and a B.A. in economics from New York University. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Dr. Ayandele. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. I am going to share my screen and okay, yes, everybody can see this. Thank you again, Michelle, for the introduction. And I am very excited to be here to share my research with the Center for Global Affairs family. Today's workshop is based on my recently organized workshop that I conducted at NYU, where over 20 African scholars here, as well as in the continent and in Europe, gathered to explore the economic and security determinants that are crucial for achieving a stable and prosperous Africa. And that is why the talk is entitled today, Competition or Collaboration, Exploring the Economic and Security Determinants for a Stable Africa. Before I begin, I really want to give a background and context to the talk today, and it's really inspired by this project, African Wars in the 21st Century. And then we're going to really hone in on transnational linkages and informal markets. And that is because when we think about development in the African continent, we tend to focus on formal institutions. So the talk today is shifting our focus from formal institutions to informal markets, the informal sector, and how that could possibly bring about stabilization and development on the continent. And then I would conclude with a quote that I think is very important for us to take away. And then we would open the floor up, as Michelle had said, to questions and answers. So what is the background? What is African Wars in the 21st century? So African Wars in the 21st century is part of a bigger project that I started with a colleague, Dr. Yvonne Ilunga, about 3 years ago. And the project's goal and objective is to really understand and assess the effectiveness of African militaries and various civil military interactions, especially when we think about the context of fragility, development, and peace recovery. So the types of workshops that are organized are really aimed to bridge that policy research gap. So we bring together scholars, policy analysts, international organization representatives, and the aim is to really discuss current as well as emerging goals and themes and trends that are related to, African military studies as well as African development from a very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective. So the workshop that was held that focused on Africa's economic and security determinants was because when we think about development, we can't think about security. And when we think about security, we can't think about development because they are very, very mutually reinforcing and closely linked. And that's why for the workshop that was organized last month, we really tailored around three things. The first being transnational linkages, regional integration, indigenous economic practices, and informal networks as stabilization mechanisms. And this is what I'm really going to focus this talk and this discussion today on. We also talked about regional ad hoc initiatives, especially the role of international partners, as well as multinational private actors, social responsibility, and the regionalization of security responses. So as I said, we're going to be focusing on the first theme, which is transnational linkages and informal markets. And that is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, when we think about development in many African countries, when we're bringing up discussions on investments, on foreign direct investments, on economic development, it's really limited to formal economic sectors. And this is exemplified when we think about private sector investors, when we think about international financial institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF. When we're evaluating a state's current or future economic prospects, we tend to think about measures such as, gross domestic product, GDP, and we use these measures to track economic growth. But on the flip side, there's this budding informal sector that we especially see on the African continent. So majority of African economic activities are really within this informal market sector, which comprises, depending on who you ask, 70 to 85% of the African workforce. This is a huge amount of individuals that are employed by the informal market. This sector is also unique, and we're going to see with the pictures and as I discuss this presentation, that it is very multidimensional and it is very multi-sectoral. And because of this informal market, the informal sector, it really provides this realistic opportunity for millions of Africans to have a chance at economic activity and to lift them up from poverty. But there's this continued resistance, and we see this in the literature, we see this in policy circles, we see this in statements when we're thinking about like a post-COVID Africa and how to jumpstart a lot of African economies, that there's this continued resistance to prioritize this market, to prioritize indigenous economic practices, especially when we're thinking about development, African development. And government officials and certain researchers and practitioners have cited the unpredictability and the organized nature of the informal market as a very major challenge and the reason why they don't prioritize the sector. At the same time, others have erroneously equated the informal sector to illegality. And we're going to talk about that later on, in the talk. But I want to argue that the prospect, the opportunity that the informal market brought and brings to African development was what really underpinned this session's topic and the questions that we were concerned with. The first being, how should we define the informal sector? The second being, what are the challenges that, when it comes to the informal sector, as well as the terminology that we use in thinking about the characteristics of the market? Sorry, excuse me. And the third being, how can we integrate the informal sector when we're thinking about broader regional economic activities of African states? And I'm going to go through each of these questions and the findings from the workshop reports and the policy recommendations, because they are very, very important when we're thinking about contextualizing African development and stability. So when it comes to defining the informal sector, what is the informal sector? It's interesting because, as I said, over 20 African scholars gathered together, but there was no consensus on the definition. depending on your background, whether your background was in economics or in political science or in sociology or in history, we all had different definitions of how the informal sector should be defined or how it should be characterized. However, we did have consensus when it came to how we define informal activities. And we highlighted and we came to a consensus that informal activities are activities that are not recorded by the state. It was also noted that informality, when we think about the informal market, when we think about the informal sector, it's embedded into the African society. So in this picture, for example, this is a typical urban city in an African state where there are traffic jams and we see entrepreneurs, as I call them, selling their goods, and passengers and drivers also buying said goods. In the slide before, and I'm going to go back, we see, for example, women who are tailors that people tend to take their clothes to mend. And we also see from the other slides, for example, market women at the roadside selling their produce, or in an urban market in the middle of a city where you can buy goods such as clothes and other materialistic things. So that's why we had a very, very, very hard time with the consensus of what is the informal sector, but we could come to an agreement with, okay, these are the activities that make up the informal sector, which are activities that are not recorded by the state. So the informal sector consists of enterprises that benefit families, that benefit economies, and informality is a way of life for a lot of African individuals. So what are the challenges with the informal sector, with some of the terminologies that we use when we're trying to characterize the informal sector? And it was very interesting because one participant, when we were trying to understand and assess this question, she posed this question of why do we group and categorize workers as informal and formal? And she made a very good point, which was this constant use of informal, this terminology, it really sets actors in this category as people who don't have agency. And we know that is not true. And when we think about the informal sector and the informal economy, we usually think, okay, these workers lack access to credit or lack access to banks or lack access to loan facilities. But the point was made that informal workers have from time had formal ways of documenting their activities. And we can see this with cooperative societies, for example. So we came to, well, one side of the room came to an agreement that maybe we shouldn't call them informal workers. Maybe they should just be grouped under non-state actors that, as we group other groups or civil society groups. And again, as I said, depending on your background, some people also still wanted that terminology of informal market to really capture the multidimensionality and multi-sectoral aspect of the market. Additionally, it was noted that those in the informal sectors don't really perceive themselves as being informal. More likely, they see themselves as entrepreneurs, as business enterprises, and some would even argue hustlers. So we really have to ask ourselves what this informalization is a symptom of. This needs to understand how the creation and how this growing informal sector, what it is saying about how different actors, how different stakeholders are reacting to, business environments, or reacting to state policies, or reacting, might I argue, to conflict. And then we have this competition when it comes to mobilizing domestic resources from the informal sector. And yes, you have countries such as Nigeria, where individuals in the sectors are, some would argue, the most overtaxed. But in most countries, the informal sector is not really captured in tax nets. And that's because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, they are not recorded. So for many participants, for some participants, this lack of recording, it was a challenge, and it's going to continue to pose a challenge because it creates vulnerability, it creates markets for corruption, and it also limits the ability of the sector to grow. And it's very important because, when we were discussing the relationship between informality and security, it was brought up that the informal sector is very, very easy prey for conflict entrepreneurs. So the conflict dynamics in the presence of the informal market are exacerbated and exploited by transnational armed groups, for example. So when we're thinking about the informal sector, when we're thinking about protecting some of these workers, it's very important for us to look at the exploitation of conflict dynamics that various stakeholders are prone to in really building a very peaceful and stable continent. And then there was this question of, how do we integrate the informal sector into the broader regional economic activities of African states? And for me, this was the very, very, very most important sector when we're thinking about transnational linkages and the informal market. And that is because the informal sector is a broad basket of many different services and experiences. And we have shown that with the many pictures that, I have put and I've tried to sprinkle in the presentation. And these different services and experiences are based off of, the country and the geographic location. But it's also very important to note that when we think about informal markets, when we think about the informal economy, it's not just limited to the African continent or middle or low income countries. We see this across various global South countries, and it manifests in various ways. So there's really a need to do taxonomy on what the informal sector means. I know this is going to be a very difficult challenge because based off of our backgrounds and your backgrounds and what you're bringing in and your experiences, it's going to be very difficult to come to a consensus of a definition. But maybe instead of a definition, we may do characteristics, like how in this workshop, we agreed that, okay, maybe we need to agree on what an informal activity means or what it looks like, and that was it not being captured by the state. Now, when it comes to regionalization, there's a very, very important distinction that needs to be made and said in terms of definitions between informal workers as well as informal cross-border trade. And this is because when we think about informal cross-border trade, this refers to the nature of transactions, trade flows that are not registered, that are not going through official customs systems. You're not paying taxes, AKA smuggling. So, the goods basically cross the borders instead of, the custom officials. And, when we try to dissect why this was happening, especially in various border communities in African states, we came up with high tariffs. So, the higher the trade protections, the higher the high tariffs that government officials and policymakers implement, we're going to see a higher share of informal transactions of goods, smuggling across the borders. And, with smuggling also comes conflict, also comes transnational, non-state armed groups, and what that might mean for security. So trade informality is in part due to the incentives that are also created by the state, that are created by state trade policies. So states have a very, very important role to play in trying to understand the nuances of what the informal market and what the informal sector can look like. Additionally, as I showed in some of the pictures in the previous slides, when we think about the informal sector, we also have to think in terms of social and economic relationships. So I remember when I was growing up, for example, in the community that we lived in, whoever was the security guard also had, like, for example, a mini kiosk where, we could buy everyday household goods. If you wanted to make your hair, you knew your hairdresser. She didn't necessarily have a shop that was paying taxes, but everybody knew her. Everybody went to her house to get their hair done. The same thing with our cobbler, the same thing with the tailor. So this mobility facilitation of social and economic relationships are very crucial for what we would say is a borderless Africa, especially if we want to implement the AFTA Act, which is the Africa Free Trade Continental Act, which is very, very important for regionalization of trade. And this is because informal workers, non-state actors are really going to continue to be the linchpin of inclusive economic growth. So in the pictures, we have seen young Africans, we have seen men, we have seen women. The informal sector really is a reflection of the budding African society. And it is really going to push the limits to how we think about cross-border trade. So there's this need to prioritize to support informal markets, to support informal workers. And this is because, you know, the state has really neglected structures that local communities have happened to manage and moderate when it comes to indigenous economic practices. If you go to any border community in any African state, you would see informal sector activities going, people buying and selling goods, people bartering with goods and services. So there's really a need to look inwards and to see how the societies are organized and what are the opportunities for strengthening cross-border trade by leveraging this local indigenization. And it's also very important to note that in the same way, the informal movement and informal trade can be used for transnational organized crime, it can also be used by state leaders for intelligence gathering and for cooperation between states. And I would argue that this would actually lead to positive cross-border interactions that we really need in securing a prosperous continent. So with that said, I want to leave us with this quote, and this quote is from all the perspectives from this workshop report, which is, the informal system may not appear to be an obviously vulnerable system to conflict. So for states, for policymakers, for scholars such as myself, for people that are interested in African political economies, it's very important that we take a crucial step to understand how the informal sector, how actors in this market are managing to survive despite the adverse dynamics, despite the many conflicts that we are seeing in a lot of African states. So people, traders, local systems are going to continue to operate. So it is up to states, it is up to regional organizations, it is up to international organizations to learn how they function and how they adapt their state building strategies accordingly. Thank you again, and I will pass it off to Michelle to hone in on the question and answers.
Amazing. Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So
yeah.
We do have a question from an audience member. It's a little it's a little off topic, but maybe you can talk to it given some of your work. And this attendee is interested in sort of the rights of the LGBTQ plus community in Africa. I don't know how much your work has covered that, but if there's any comments or research you've done in that area.
So my work doesn't really cover the LGBTQ plus community, so I wouldn't want to make a comment that might be erroneous in that respect. So yes, my capacity really doesn't delve into that. I'm so sorry to that person who asked the question. I wish I could answer.
Great, thank you for that. All right. Great. Well, we are waiting. Oh, here we go. Another question just came in. Do you think changing the name to non-state actors would be more encompassing?
Yes, I believe so. I think if we change the terminology from informal workers to non-state workers, maybe government officials as well as policymakers, domestic as well as foreign, would take the sector more seriously. Non-state workers are seen as the backbone for a very democratic society, for example, as well as in protecting and respecting civil and political leadership and rights. So I do believe that if we bring them in, maybe it might bring an economic dimension into how we think about non-state actors with informal workers.
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering, have you done any comparative work with other informal non-state actors that have sort of formed the way that you've taken a look at the sector within Africa?
Definitely, yes. And the comparative work is actually one of the studies that we're doing, which is the evolution of the technology space, right? That we are seeing, the budding technology space that we are seeing on the African continent. So we have taken some tech startup companies from Nigeria, from Kenya, from South Africa to see how they came in as informal sector workers and then transform themselves into the formal institutions. There's this drive actually to not necessarily formalize the informal sector, but modernize and digitize the informal sector so that, you know, it is more encompassing with the times of today. And maybe state leaders are going to be able to capture and record them. And if they have that, then they can maybe, you know, bring them into the forefold of thinking about economic policies. So yeah, there is a study, and hopefully the study would be published next year, but the workshop report, the findings from this workshop report are going to be published next month. So hopefully that also inspires people who are on this call today to look at particular countries who are doing good work in modernizing and digitizing the informal sector in those countries.
That's great. So another participant asked, does any of your work look at the challenges being faced by small farmers, organic farming, water issues, and the power of corporate interests by, you know, large multinational companies like Monsanto?
Yes, yes, definitely. We definitely look at that. And this is why it's important to prioritize and support the informal sector. And I remember that there was a paper that we had written, myself and my colleague, and we had talked about the lack of social safety nets, especially when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, corporate interests, they did get this bailout, but small farmers didn't necessarily get this bailout. And what this means for a post-COVID Africa with a lot of, you know, businesses, informal businesses going out of business. And what it means to jumpstart, especially when we're thinking about a budding economy. Small farmers are very, very important. And it's also important to look at how the rural communities, the rural sector, are able to affect the urban sector. So instead of just looking at the positive spillovers from urban to rural, also looking at the positive spillovers from rural to urban.
That's great. So another participant is asking, do you anticipate that there would be resistance from somebody who is moving from the informal sector to the formal sector in terms of taxation regulation?
That was a big like contention in the workshop, because this was something that came up and the room was split, you know. So some people had said, I do not think informal workers would mind being taxed if they see that their money is going into something, whether it is, you know, social protection services, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is roads. And somebody made a very good point that they are taxed anyways. So for example, if you're a market woman, right, you basically pay your levies to the Market Women Association, and then you pay your levies to, you know, the people who give you protection, right? And even for you to bring your goods from the rural area to the urban area, there are so many checkpoints of, you know, state security forces that you're already, you know, paying a little something too. So all those things to them, to these workers, are forms of taxation, right? But for us, because we have formalized taxation as, okay, if you have a business that is registered, you pay taxes to the government. But for the informal sector, it looks very different. So it's up to state leaders to look at the local ways that, market women, for example, or tailors, for example, or, I would even say tech entrepreneurs who are wanting to enter this market are viewing themselves as agents and how they're contributing to the communities, for the government to say, okay, maybe we need a little bit more levy, or maybe we need a little bit more tax, and people buy in to that. But for some other people, it was a no, like, I don't think they want to be formalized. So somebody actually made a good point of saying, maybe instead of calling this situation an informal market or informal sector, maybe just call it free entrepreneurship, right? And maybe more people will be able to buy into this concept.
That's interesting. I like that. So the next question comes from a faculty colleague. Can you elaborate a bit more on how the informal sector could be leveraged to counter terrorism, organized crime, and are there any worries about rogue or nefarious states or leaders leveraging the informal sector to their benefit? And this questioner is thinking about the recent history of African coups.
Definitely. Yes, there are concerns about the informal sector being used to promote the activities of transnational non-state armed groups, right? And that's because of the mobility, right? The social as well as the economic relationships that I had alluded to. So I know, for example, with Boko Haram and the Lake Chad region, when it comes to cattle rustling and the selling and buying of cattle, it's seen as an informal trade, an informal market activity, and that has been linked to funding the activities of the terrorist group Boko Haram. But on the flip side, when we have a conflict-ridden area or a conflict-torn area, a lot of people argue that, activity is coming into that area when you start seeing people buying and selling goods. So people are feeling more secure into coming back into those communities, setting up this mini kiosk where they can buy and sell their goods. I also think with the mobility, especially when it comes to human intelligence, this is where we can leverage the informal sector. There are so many indigenous practices that are ingrained into how people have solved conflict that we need to tap into when we're thinking about counterterrorism, when we're thinking about organized crime. So I know, the go-to is to say, shore up border intelligence, right? Put more state security forces in borders where we see a lot of these activities from organized crime or terrorism, but maybe we go to the community leaders, right? Because they understand the terrain better than border security officials might be able to understand the terrain, and listen to how from time in those communities, they have managed conflict. So yes, the informal sector, the informal market, informal trading, informal activities, I do believe are very, very essential to counterterrorism. But at the same vein, yes, they do exacerbate some of the activities that we have seen from transnational organized crime, and for some leaders too. That's how they make their money with illicit gun trafficking and illicit goods trafficking.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. The next question deals a little bit with trust and corruption and some geopolitics. So, do you get a sense that there is citizens' trust in their government? Is corruption, a big issue? And do you think the geopolitical rivalry between China and the US is impacting this?
Yes, definitely. With citizens' trust in African state governments, it's declining, right? And that is because I would argue the lack of social nets that was provided to the informal sector that basically makes up, as I said, 85% of the workforce. So people feel frustrated, there are high unemployment rates, and this has set a fertile ground for the mobilization and the recruitment of foot soldiers in that sense. And yes, bribery and corruption is still a very big problem. If you go to border communities, yes, you can bribe a custom official for you to smuggle a good. So yes, it is still a very, very big problem. But when it comes to China and the US for influence on the continent, we just have to continue to see how it plays out. I think it provides African states with options, but those options aren't necessarily being leveraged into the informal market. It's more leveraged into formal institutions, which a lot of scholars and policy makers have argued is not enough. It's not inclusive. So I think for more influence with regards to China and US is going to be very dependent on how their policies are inclusive, and the way that the continent views this, I would argue, two superpowers.
That's great. Fantastic. While we wait to see if any last questions come in, can we let folks know how they can obtain the report that will be published next month?
Oh, yes. So it would be live on CGA's website. And I believe Michelle would also, for those who are interested, send a copy of the report.
Absolutely. Great. So unless there are any additional questions that come in, I think we can say a big thank you to Jumo for today's presentation. Are there any last takeaways that you'd like to share with our group before we log off?
Yes, I want to say that it's very, very important for us to shift away from a lot of the biases that we have about development and how to develop the global South. So as I said, the informal sector, yes, while it is a very African way of life, it is also a way of life for millions of people in other global South countries. So it's very, very necessary for scholars as well as policymakers to understand the nuances of the informal sector, how it manifests in different local contexts, and the opportunities we can use in really stabilizing a lot of states, regions, because that would be very, very useful for a stable global order.
Great. Yeah. Very, very important and great words to end on. Thank you again to Jumo. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. As she mentioned, the report will be coming out next month. We'll have it on our website and send out a follow-up message. In the meantime, we'll also send out a follow-up message with a video from today's event if you'd like to revisit any of the presentation. And thank you again. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.